In April 1945, the Second World War was coming to its end in Europe. The Nazi regime was on its last legs. The main hostilities were already unfolding on German territory. Anglo-American troops entered the Ruhr area, Bavaria and Hesse from the west. The Red Army, advancing from the east, took Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, Saxony, and surrounded Berlin. Crushing the remnants of the Third Reich's armies, the fighting forces of the First Ukrainian Front, led by Marshal Ivan Konev, and the 12th U.S. Army Group, led by General Omar Bradley, were rapidly moving towards the center of Germany. In accordance with the agreements between the leaders of the anti-Hitler coalition, Soviet and American troops were to meet on the Elbe River.
Войска Первого Украинского фронта и союзные нам англо-американские войска ударом с востока и запада рассекли фронт немецких войск, и 25 апреля 13 часов 30 минут соединились в центре Германии в районе города Таргау.
Two armies, American and Soviet ones, had traveled different paths before that long-awaited meeting took place. The link-up on the Elbe embodied the spirit of such true alliance. Despite the fact that both the Soviet Union and the United States saw the future of post-war Europe differently, yet the fight against Nazism united the two nations to achieve the main goal, ridding the world of this brown plague, and they reached this common goal.
The history of World War II accurately records the place, date, and even time of the link-up between Soviet and American troops. However, the fraternization of the soldiers on the Elbe lasted 10 days. There were numerous link-ups, each of them being important in its own way. In this film, we'll cover 5 link-ups in different cities on different days and even in different years, but they all were imbued with the spirit of soldierly brotherhood and hope for a lasting and happy peace. This photograph, taken by a correspondent of the US Life magazine, once made the front pages of newspapers all over the world. Today, no publication devoted to the historic Soviet and American link-up can do without it. Pictured are US Army 2nd Lieutenant William Robertson and Red Army Guards Lieutenant Alexander Silvashko. They were the first representatives of the Allied armies to shake hands on the Elbe. Both Silvashko and Robertson remembered that meeting as a real adventure. However, it did not begin with handshakes and hugs, but with shelling. 25th of April, 1945, Germany, eastern bank of the Elbe, the vicinity of Torgau. Silvashko told, "The morning of the 25th of April, 1945 was warm and sunny. The scent of lilacs was drowning out the smell of gunpowder and metal. There was absolute silence. To us, accustomed to the rumble of guns, this seemed somehow unnatural, and we suddenly felt that the war was ending." Suddenly, the Germans showed up on the other side of the Elbe. They were dressed in unfamiliar uniforms that Silvashko had never seen before. Our artillery fired 2 warning shots at the adversary. Those whom the Soviet soldiers mistook for Germans disappeared, but reappeared an hour later and hoisted a red and white striped mattress-like flag over the bell tower. Silvashko was not aware back then that the flag was hoisted by U.S. Army 2nd Lieutenant William Robertson.
He was very cheerful and very defiant. Such a daring man. One of his own mates says, "Well, Robertson is a real cowboy."
As it turned out later, Robertson ended up on the bank of the Elbe by accident. He was an officer in charge of the patrol and was assigned by his command to go around the territories west of the Elbe, searching for Germans willing to surrender. The Germans surrendered readily. The 2nd lieutenant would send them with a convoy to the location of his unit and drove on, increasingly deviating from the set route, until he reached the Elbe and saw Soviet soldiers on the opposite bank. Robertson immediately recognized them by the medals glistening in the sun. Unlike the Americans and Germans, the Russians did not take off their battle honors as they engaged in combat.
Then what did they do? They found a blanket and a broken pharmacy. They had no paint and they didn't have an American flag. So they made the red stripes of the American flag out of potassium permanganate and using some other medicines. To cut a long story short, they hung this cloth as an American flag on the bell tower.
Yet Russians did not recognize the flag and refused to come in contact. Robertson then brought a Soviet officer who could speak some English from a nearby camp for prisoners of war and came out to the riverbank with him. From Silvashko's memoirs, I saw a man in the uniform of a concentration camp prisoner who shouted hoarsely, "Comrades, don't shoot! These are our allies." The Allies met in the middle of the ruined bridge over the Elbe, whose blast-mangled spans curved in the shape of the Latin letter V, victory.
I can't forget the joyful feeling when we crossed the bridge and met the Soviet soldiers. That was a thrilling encounter and we were proud to be there. Everyone, Americans and Russians alike, were unusually thrilled, hugging and patting each other on the back. We celebrated that event, drinking schnapps and cognac which the Russians had, to each other's health. That was a genuine celebration.
At the headquarters of the American 69th Infantry Division in the town of Tryson, a celebratory dinner was held in honor of the Soviet soldiers, which dragged on into the morning. But Robertson left immediately after the first toast. By order of the division commander, he was placed under arrest. By his unauthorized actions, the second lieutenant jeopardized the agreements between the Allies, whereby the Red Army was not to cross the Elbe, while the U.S. Army was not to go further than the western bank of the Elbe's tributary, the Mulde River. The reapproachment of troops was supposed to be conducted in an orderly manner, so as not to provoke an emergency in the form of an unauthorized firefight.
I have to say that in the war history there has probably never been such a thing that the Allies had almost no joint operation after all. The troops didn't know each other, they could not identify each other, there was no experience in that respect.
Lieutenant Robertson was lucky not to be court-martialed. General Omar Bradley himself stood up for him. The commander forgave the negligent officer, because after all, it was thanks to him that the historic meeting, which everyone was looking forward to, did happen. In his memoirs, General Bradley lamented that the American troops arrived at the Elbe 12 days ahead of the Red Army and were bored waiting for the late arriving Russians. But he forgot to tell us that the Americans were marching through Germany almost unhindered. The Germans surrendered to them by whole divisions, while burgomasters hurriedly handed them the keys to their cities. On the other hand, our troops were breaking through to the Elbe with heavy fighting.
To them, the war was, even American historians have noted that, while a kind of sport, dangerous as it was, but a sport, it's not like we perceived it, a kind of life and death struggle.
General Alexei Zhadov, commander of the 5th Guards Army, responded to Bradley's lamentations as follows in his memoirs. The Americans waited 12 days for us. We'd been waiting for them 2 years and a half. For 2.5 years, the Red Army had been waiting for the Allies to open a second front in Europe, and waited until it was no longer actually needed.
It's no coincidence that even the soldiers would utter a joke as they opened American canned food. They used to say, well, let's open a second front. A joke as it was charged with political overtones.
That's why neither Alexander Silvashko nor the men of his platoon recognized the Americans. After so many years of waiting, the Allies seemed like mythical characters, almost fairy tale-like figures to our soldiers. 25th of April 1945, Germany. Western bank of the Elbe, the vicinity of Raisa.
The first official link-up is thought to have occurred at 3:30 p.m. on the 25th of April 1945, when Lieutenant Robertson and Lieutenant Silvashko met near Torgau. Well, actually even before that, there had been a meeting between Lieutenant Kotzebu and Russian Lieutenant Goloborodko.
Albert Kotzebu and Grigory Goloborodko were frontline scouts. Kotzebu commanded a platoon and Goloborodko was in charge of a company. They had met a few kilometers outside the town of Raisa 4 hours before Silvashko and Robertson met in Torgau. Their meeting was not accidental. It was planned and very much expected. Kotzebue and Galabarodka were scouting the location of the Allies by order of their command centers. Kotzebue also had a personal interest in this matter. He believed he had Russian roots.
The Kotzebue is an old German clan that settled in Russia. One of his ancestors, August Kotzebue, was a very famous playwright. He had many sons. One of them, Otto Kotzebue, made several round-world voyages, including one with Krusenstern. One of the straits in the Alaska area is named after him.
Looking at the Soviet soldiers and officers, Albert Kotzebue was enthusiastic about the fact that his ancestors had served Russia as valiantly as those Soviet guys decorated with medals and insignia.
They said how good, how valiant you are in beating the Germans. We were looking forward to meeting you. That was a sincere confession indeed.
Memories of the Elbe veterans on the American side are very emotional. Yet the Soviet participants of the linkup spoke about it with restraint, their style being a little tight.
And when they tap you on the shoulder and say, "Hi there, you're such a cool guy, it's great that we've met," maybe these emotions were not so high because these emotions peaked when they performed their combat exploits. That's when the emotions ran high.
By the time of the Elbe linkup, Senior Lieutenant Galabarodka had been 1,400 days at war. He went to the front as a volunteer in the first days of the war, survived the retreat of 1941, participated in the Battle of Stalingrad, and then step by step, meter by meter, reclaimed his native land from the enemy. And passing through the country ravaged by the Nazis, cities in ruins and burnt villages, through the pain, sorrow, and wail of ordinary Russian people, he reached the Elbe. By the 25th of April, Lieutenant Kotzebue had only 72 days of combat time, had not participated in any serious battle, and had not suffered even a light wound. The Elbe linkup became the main event in his frontline biography. After shaking hands with the Soviet soldiers, Kotzebue came up with an idea. Guys, let's vow right now to do everything in our power to preclude wars on Earth. And they swore an oath.
Absolutely everyone remembered that amazing feeling and hoped for a lasting peace. As long as we are alive, and as long as we are here now, and as long as we are experiencing this relief, let's hope that peace would be lasting.
On the evening of the 25th of April 1945, reports on Soviet and American troops linking up on the Elbe reached the White House, Downing Street, and the Kremlin. On the 27th of April 1945, the world's radio stations broadcast the addresses by the three leaders of the anti-Hitler coalition countries, who referred to the Elbe linkup as an epochal event that marked the end of the war in Europe. In Moscow, fireworks were staged to honor the Elbe linkup, 24 volleys from 324 guns. The festivities took place in Times Square, New York City. While in Germany, thousands of Soviet and US soldiers and officers were fraternizing on the banks of the Elbe between the towns of Torgau and Raisa. Communication was unrestricted by the command. Nevertheless, the US Department of Defense did provide its military with instructions.
Early in 1945, a brochure was released for American officers, above all, on how to behave in case of an encounter with Russian troops. Make sure you shake hands with the Russians, because they love that as a sign of hospitality. When, for example, you attend some concert and they have many concert brigades on the Russian front, if you like it, abstain from whistling, which could be your habit in America. Clap your hands instead. This is a must.
The language barrier did not prevent the soldiers from telling each other about their lives and operational record, showing photos of their wives and children, or exchanging gifts.
Слушайте, у вас есть рубль? Рубль? Да. Вот червоный. О, подарите его мне, как память нашей встречи на Эльбе. Только напишите что-нибудь. А я вам доллар.
Примите этот американский вездеход, для которого нет преград во всем мире.
Этот червонец дороже миллиона, ибо дружбу солдат нельзя купить ни за какие деньги. Хо-хо.
The most popular Soviet souvenir was stars from the wedge caps, whereas the most popular American souvenir was cigarettes. Some of our soldiers saw them for the first time, occasionally lighting them up on the filter side, and marveled at the fact that they smoked cotton wool in America. However, everybody equally liked the American brandy and the Russian vodka. In those days, we were drunk day and night, US veterans later recounted, but not from the wine. but from happiness. It seemed to us that friendship between the USA and the USSR would last forever, for we are very much alike. Americans knew what they were talking about. They read about the similarities between our nations in the aforementioned instruction issued by the Department of Defense.
The Soviet Union is a huge country with boundless territories, and America is also a large country with vast expanses. Here in America we have black people, the indigenous Indian population, European migrants. Yours is also a multi-ethnic nation. We are open, they are also open, we are people of action, and they are also people of action. Today, as we read these lines, we can hardly believe our eyes. Could it be that they thought we have so much in common, but they indeed believed in what they said?
As regards the differences between the soldiers of our two nations, these were few and far between. The Americans were surprised to see the shiny waxed belt plaques and the iron uniforms of the Soviet military. Why try so hard? It's not like we're on parade, they asked. Ours in turn were bewildered at American laxity and lack of discipline. The 27th of April, 1945, Germany, eastern bank of the Elbe, the village of Verdau. The linkups on the Elbe took place by rank. At first, the privates and commissioned officers, then the commanders of divisions, corps, armies. Major General Gleb Baklanov, commander of the 34th Guards Rifle Corps, was commissioned by the front commander Marshal Konev with the organization of receptions for the top brass. The combat general had to act as a diplomat.
Konev, to the best of my knowledge, thought that my father, perhaps by virtue of his non-proletarian origin, fluency in some foreign languages and very good knowledge of protocol formalities, could seriously assist in organizational matters related to the Elbe linkup.
Footage of a gala dinner held on the 27th of April 1945 in honor of Major General Clarence Hubner, commander of the 5th Corps, has been preserved. Dinner was served in the garden. The menu included borscht with pampushki, buns with garlic, Siberian dumplings, vodka, cognac, and German wines. Combat medics from the field hospital performed the duties of waitresses. Here is General Baklanov talking with General Hubner, and here is the poet and war correspondent Konstantin Simonov. He arrived at the Elbe on the 25th of April 1945, not to miss any significant events of those days. There are also other generalists sitting at the table, most of them from the Western nations. Our counterintelligence knew that most of the Western war correspondents on the Elbe combined journalism with espionage.
Everything wasn't so simple there between us and the Americans at that time. We were allies. However, this issue related to the protection of military secrecy was of course taken very seriously in the course of that event organization.
A new post-war map of Europe was taking shape in spring 1945. What states would be in the Soviet sphere of influence, and which ones would be under the patronage of the UK and the US depended on how far the Red Army might advance. 5th of May 1945, Germany, eastern bank of the Elbe, the town of Libusa. Commander of the 1st Ukrainian Front, Marshal Konev, and commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group, General Omar Bradley, met in the town of Libusa, 30 kilometers off Torgau, on the 5th of May 1945. According to the tradition already established at the Elbe, they began with an exchange of gifts. Bradley presented Konev with a Willys automobile, while Konev presented Bradley with his warhorse.
Well, there are plenty of cars, but try growing a warhorse and looking after it. This was really a royal gift, this Don Stallion.
This was not only a friendly encounter, but also a business meeting. Therefore, Konev was very pleased with another gift made by Bradley. In a conversation about the so-called Red Lines, the American general initiated the Soviet marshal into some of Churchill's plans.
It was decided that American troops should not cross the peculiar red line which ran along the border between the cities of Chemnitz, Carlsbad and Pilsen. And when Bradley arrived at Konev's headquarters, they went straight to the map, and Bradley mentioned that Churchill was inciting Eisenhower, who was the commander-in-chief of the US forces in Europe, saying that the Americans should not mind any red lines and that it was possible to advance further.
Konev stated that Churchill's intrigues were a clear indication of his desire to set the Russians and Americans at loggerheads. Soviet troops will not leave the occupied territories. The American army should not move further east.
And Bradley, having made a promise not to cross those lines, kept it. It was a very important political moment of this very meeting, the spirit of the Elbe.
The alliance between the USSR, the UK, and the US was a coalition against the common foe. And so, the imminent victory over Nazi Germany was to put an end to this alliance. On the banks of the Elbe River, they were still toasting peace and friendship, while at the very top, on Churchill's personal orders, with the tacit approval of the new US President Harry Truman, they were already planning a war against the Soviets. The British, American, and German troops from among those who had voluntarily surrendered to the Allies were to make a joint stand against the Red Army.
These prisoners of war were recruited to form 10 divisions of German soldiers. They were to be armed, their combat capabilities would be great, and they would fight well against the Russians.
The plan was named Operation Unthinkable. The war that seemed unthinkable to the Elbe soldiers was to break out on the 1st of July 1945.
But after the chiefs of staff, operational officers figured out how many forces the Red Army had and how many the Allies had, they came to the conclusion that on the Baltic we have complete superiority. The Russians have good fighters, good pilots, but we still have more bomber aircraft. But the ground troops, tank troops, motorized infantry, what is called motorized troops, here unfortunately the Russians outnumber us several times. Also they are experienced, they are strong, they will throw us into the English Channel.
In Moscow, they knew that the friendly paradise of the Elbe served as a cover-up for aggressive preparations.
We were aware that the military and political situation will regrettably be far from perfect, and had been systematically preparing for this challenge during the last months of the war.
Прощайте. Встретились мы с вами как союзники, жили как соседи. Расстаемся как друзья. Так сделайте все, чтобы мы в будущем не встретились с вами как враги.
The lilacs of 1945 have lost their bloom on the Elbe. The victory salutes thundered down. The world's first nuclear mushrooms rose over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then President Truman approved the secret military plan christened as Totality.
And there were other plans after the United States became nuclear-armed. Plans to bomb first 20, then 50 major industrial centers of the Soviet Union. But our physicists, with the help of Soviet foreign intelligence, uncovered the US plans and created our Soviet nuclear shield, which allowed to prevent the catastrophe from actually happening.
In March 1946, then already former Prime Minister Churchill delivered a speech in the American city of Fulton, where he declared the USSR an enemy of the Western world. And the spirit of the Elbe, like the fragrance of lilacs, melted into the stale air of a new epoch, the Cold War era. May 1955, Soviet Union, Moscow.
Накануне Дня Победы члены Комитета по проведению встречи советских и американских ветеранов Второй мировой войны встречали на Внуковском аэродроме столицы прибывших американских ветеранов встречи на Эльбе. Мюррей Шульман, Клод Мур, Байрон Шивер, Жозеф Половский. 10 лет тому назад они встретились на Эльбе и остались верны своей боевой солдатской дружбе.
By flying to Moscow in May 1955, American veterans accomplished a feat, given that an anti-communist hysteria was reigning supreme in the US, starting in the late 1940s. People suspected of any fondness for the USSR would go through Senator McCarthy's House Un-American Activities Committee. They were harassed, stripped of their jobs, expelled from the country. Both the Elbe veterans themselves and their family members would become victims of the witch hunt. Joseph Pawlowski, the organizer of the trip to Moscow, was denounced, libeled, and accused of spying for the USSR.
Prior to my departure from New York City, I called my mother. She said, "What can you offer in response to the warm welcome that awaits you in the Soviet Union?" I answered, "Goodwill and open soul."
In April 1945, Private Pawlowski served in the formation of Albert Kotzebue. 10 years later in Moscow, he recalled the vow made by the American and Soviet soldiers on the Elbe. "It's a pity we didn't tell the journalists about our vow back then," Pawlowski lamented naively. "We wanted to keep it in our souls, but we should have shouted it to the whole world. And then I'm sure the relations between our nations would still be friendly now." The Konev family archive contains a letter that Pawlowski wrote to the Soviet Marshal.
And he repeats in this letter many times that he wants this memory to be preserved, that we should remain true to this oath on the Elbe.
Once a year on the 25th of April, for several decades in a row, Joseph Pulowski would walk onto the Michigan Avenue Bridge in his native Chicago to hand out anti-war leaflets printed on his own money to passers-by, telling people about the Elbe linkup. As long as anyone remembers the day when the current adversaries were friends, hope for the future lives on. Mr. Pulowski even sent his proposal to the UN to proclaim the 25th of April as the Elbe Day. In 1983, according to his will, he was buried in Torgau, the place where he took the oath that shaped the rest of his life. The relations between the US and Russia seemed to finally improve after the collapse of the USSR and the end of the Cold War. In 1995, memorial plaques were set up on Moscow's Poklonnaya Hill and Arlington National Cemetery near Washington in honor of the military alliance between the United States and the USSR during World War II. Every year on the 25th of April, official representatives of Russia and the US would lay their wreaths there. Time went by. The gilding on the granite faded. The bronze would be covered with patina. The relations between Russia and the United States has again stricken a bad patch.
As regards the current military and political leadership of the United States, to them, the spirit of the Elbe is an unpleasant concept. They step aside of this spirit because they see it as a reminder of the period when the role of the Soviet Union was recognized as the leading within the coalition. Unfortunately, 8 decades later, we have to admit that the spirit of the Elbe has almost completely weathered out of our bilateral relations.
In 2022, the US authorities banned Russian Federation representatives from participating in the Elbe Day celebrations at Arlington Cemetery. That ban was part of the sanctions imposed on our country in the wake of the special military operation in Ukraine.
They try to use the spirit of the Elbe in information warfare. They are saying that the Russians are bad. They don't conform to the Elbe spirit. Therefore, we have to be strong to pursue our historical policy. We should remember the Elbe. We have no right to forget it. Let them forget. But we must not let that precious experience sink into oblivion.
We annually maintain and fix up our commemorative plaque, Spirit of the Elbe, on Poklonnaya Hill to celebrate the Elbe Day in Moscow on the 25th of April. No one can forbid us to do this.
We remember and venerate the memory and the US soldiers who shook hands with our fathers and grandfathers from the great generation of victors, and we perceive it as the spirit of fighting camaraderie between our nations. The hostile policy of the United States cannot make us forget the historical facts, this historic link-up on the Elbe.
We, the heirs of the soldiers who won World War II, have kept and will keep our allegiance to the spirit of the Elbe, the symbol of peaceful coexistence between Russia and the West.